The focus of this lecture is going to be on efficiency. We've been looking at various market structures and thinking about whether the level of output and the prices that firms choose are those which maximize their own welfare. Do they maximize profits and so on? But now we want to ask another very important question, which is, do these prices and these outputs reflect just the private welfare of firms, or do they reflect the well-being of society at large? Are they the kinds of prices and outputs which are going to be best for consumers? Or is there a conflict between what's best for consumers and what's best for the firms? Now, in order to do that, we need to revisit our understanding of perfect competition. And when we've thought about perfect competition again, we'll have a look at monopoly power and see what conclusions that we can draw. So let's revise something that we've done with regard to perfect competition. Now, before we do that, there's an important issue that we need to be aware of. You'll sometimes hear people saying that perfect competition is a waste of time because the world isn't like the assumptions that we need to make to get perfect competition. You don't have industries which are perfectly competitive, large numbers of producers producing an exactly identical product and so on. There always seems to be things going on which interfere with our perfectly competitive assumptions, governments interfering in the market and so on. But actually, this argument is not powerful. Perfect competition is essential to understanding how the market system works, and that for two reasons. First of all, it's not a description of the world, it's an ideal against which we can measure what's going on in the world. We're not trying to describe reality. We're saying, if the world were perfectly competitive, what would that tell us about firms' behavior and so on? When you have a scientist who wants to show you how phosphorus burns, he might put a piece of phosphorus under some bell jar and set it alight and see what happens. You wouldn't expect to say to him, this isn't correct because the world isn't operating under a bell jar. He would say, no, of course it isn't. But if we can understand how the world works under these ideal conditions, we'll be able to take our understanding out into the real world and get some useful insights into the way in which the world behaves. That's exactly what we're doing with perfect competition. If we can set up what may not be a very realistic world in terms of a perfectly competitive structure, understand what that says about how firms behave and so on, we can use the insights we get into a way of understanding how the world operates. There's actually a second reason why we're very keen for you to understand perfect competition, and that's this, that actually, even though many industries are not perfectly competitive, they're close enough for us to be able to make useful predictions. If we try to analyze markets using the perfectly competitive world, we'll often find that we can get real insights into how the world behaves. So we might look at the oil market and say, well, the oil market isn't perfectly competitive. There are big producers like Saudi Arabia that control a significant part of world output. OPEC countries are very powerful. But actually, if we assume that the oil market is perfectly competitive, we can work out what we would expect to happen if demand changes or if costs change. And we'll find that very often we can predict pretty accurately how the world is going to behave in that market, even if the industry isn't quite perfectly competitive. So perfect competition is a very useful device for us in order to understand the efficiency of the way in which the world operates. So let's look back at a few ideas that we've developed with regard to perfect competition And then we'll be in a position to ask our question, how efficient does the market mechanism work in terms of consumers' welfare? Let's remind ourselves of one or two of the key things that we've seen about the perfectly competitive world. And we'll return to the diagram and show you how it operates. Here's our industry with our supply and demand curve and our market equilibrium price and quantity at P1 and Q1. And we have on the right the illustrative firm, and each firm, you remember, in perfect competition, in the long run, expects only to make a normal profit. Price just about covers average cost, so that at output Q, the firm breaks even with average revenue equaling average cost. But now what would happen if there were to be a substantial increase in demand for some reason? So if demand increases and we shift the demand curve from D1 to D2, we can see how the market is going to respond to this change in demand. First thing will happen is that because demand has increased, there's excess demand at the price of P1, and the market therefore raises the equilibrium price to P2. Equilibrium output rises because the existing firms respond by increasing their output now that it's profitable to do so. And the existing firms at this price of P2 now find that price more than covers average cost, and firms make a profit above normal. Now, does this last? This is the short run. New firms can't enter the market in the short run because that involves a change of capital. But this position that we've so far drawn is not equilibrium in the long run because profits are being made. What does profit do? It draws new producers into the market and encourages existing firms to take on more capital and to expand their output in the long run. We can see that in the diagram also. As new firms enter the market, we now shift the supply curve to the right. Remember that the supply curve is the sum of the marginal cost curves of the firms in the industry. But we now have more firms, so more marginal cost curves, so that the supply curve shifts to the right in the long run as new firms enter the market. What does this do to the price? It drives the price back down to the point where existing firms, all firms in the industry, just cover costs. But industry output is higher than it was before. We have more firms in the industry making more output in response to that increase in demand. So the market responds to changes in demand. And the process is that when demand rises, prices rise, short-run profits are made. Those short-run profits attract new firms into the market. As new firms enter the market, price is driven back down to a normal profit level. Now, before we move on, it's important to understand that the supply curve is a perfectly competitive phenomenon. We can only really talk about supply and demand when we have a market approaching something close to perfect competition. It doesn't really make sense to talk about explaining the car market in terms of supply and demand, because the market is clearly not perfectly competitive or anything like it. You can see that if you think about the nature of the supply curve. So let's return to our supply curve and do that. Here's some market where we have a supply curve. It says when the price is at P1, suppliers take that price and respond by producing Q1 output. If they find that the price is higher, at let's say P2, then they'll respond by saying it's profitable for us to supply more to the market, and output rises to Q2. Notice the assumption behind the supply curve that firms passively respond to prices determined in the market. If we take the price at P1, we'll choose Q1 output. If we take a price of P2, we'll produce Q2 output, and so on. So the perfectly competitive assumption is that firms are given a price in the market, and they respond by determining how much output to produce. They are price takers. But now think about a firm with some considerable monopoly power. Some large producer of cars, Nissan or Honda, does not say, what's the price of a car? Then we'll respond by making this amount of output. They don't take the price, they make the price, they determine the price. So it's only a perfectly competitive industry if the firm is a price taker. If the firm is a price maker, it's because they have some monopoly power. Now, having seen the nature of perfect competition then, we're now in a position to see whether firms' behaviour in this kind of market maximises just their own welfare, or whether it maximises the well-being of society as well. And we're going to see that in fact there's a very strong case for saying that in a perfectly competitive market, what maximises the well-being of producers also maximises the well-being of consumers. We'll try to see that in a number of different ways. And the first way we're going to do it is by thinking about what we would refer to as mutually beneficial exchanges. Here's some market with our supply and demand curve and an equilibrium quantity of Q and an equilibrium price at P. How many exchanges take place in the market? Answer, there are Q exchanges. It might be, say, 1,000 exchanges per day or whatever, because it's worthwhile producers producing this much and it's worthwhile consumers buying this much. If we look at some previous amount back here at say 500 units, consumers value this unit, this marginal unit, at far more than the marginal cost of producing it. It's clearly worthwhile for both the consumer and the producer that this exchange takes place. Even this 1,000th unit, it's only worthwhile to the supplier if he gets this price of P, say 10 euros. If the consumer has to pay more, he won't buy. If the supplier gets any less, he won't supply. So what we have is that this unit is just worthwhile to the supplier and the consumer. So the unit of output is made. So we have 1,000 mutually beneficial exchanges. Now let's imagine that we bring into this situation something which changes circumstances. Maybe a government thinks that they can improve things by some kind of price control. Let's suppose that a price control is introduced to try to improve the welfare of consumers, and the price control is introduced at 8 euros. It's illegal now to sell at more than 8 euros. Consumers now wish to buy, given the lower price, 1,200. But suppliers are only willing to put 700 units on the market. So how many mutually beneficial exchanges do we get? Only 700, because that's all the output that's being produced. So the difference between the 700 units of output being produced and exchanged and the 1,000 that was being produced and exchanged when the government did nothing, that 300 units are mutually beneficial exchanges that are now lost to the market. They don't take place. So we maximize the number of mutually beneficial exchanges in a perfectly competitive system by allowing the market to work, and all the exchanges which benefit producers benefit consumers as well. So that's one way in which we can begin to see why perfect competition maximizes consumer welfare. Now, there's a second way that we can think about that, and that's to go back to what we were just talking about with regard to the role of profit. Is profit something which is a measure of the exploitation of consumers? These firms are charging prices that are too high because they're taking more than sufficient to cover their costs, and so they're exploiting consumers in some way. In the context of a perfectly competitive market, we can say that the answer is no. What profits are made by firms? In the long run, they make only a normal profit, just sufficient to cover costs of production. Remember that if they were doing better than that, new firms would enter the market and drive the price down. So this normal profit that they make in the long run, is this something which is beneficial to consumers? Absolutely. If firms didn't make a normal profit, if they didn't cover opportunity cost, they'd go somewhere else and consumers wouldn't get this output at all. But what about the profit that firms make in the short run? We're looking just now at how in the short run firms can make a profit above the normal. Is that really beneficial to consumers? Absolutely, because what it is a measure of the extent to which consumers want more of a given product. Why do they make short-run profits? Because demand has risen. Why has demand risen? Because consumers are saying, we want more of this good. How are they going to get more of this good? Because prices rise, because short-run profits rise, and those short-run profits are a signal to new producers to enter into the market. So consumers find benefit in short-run profits because short-run profits are the signal which draws resources into the market in response to demand changes. So that's another way in which we can see how good perfect competition is for society at large. There's one last way we want to look at this, but it's a very important way, and that is to think about the marginal resource. What we want for a market system is that given there's a scarcity of resources, as we've seen in earlier films and lectures, we have to use these resources wisely. We want resources to be in the right industry where society values their use most. Does perfect competition see to it that resources are used in an optimal way? And the answer is yes, it does. And we can see that if we look at our diagram of a perfectly competitive firm. Let's think about this firm. It produces where marginal cost equals marginal revenue at this level of output here, given that the price is, say, €1. So this might be 20 units of output, maximizes its profit because that's where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. But now let's ask the question, what would maximize society's welfare? If you were some benign dictator and you wanted to choose the amount of output that the firm makes in order to maximize the welfare of your citizens, how much would you get the firm to make? And the answer should be 20 units of output. Let's see why. Suppose the firm were to be making 10 units of output back here. The value to society of that 10th unit of output is €1. We know that because that's the price that somebody's prepared to pay. But what does it cost society? It costs, the marginal cost, 50 cents. Why? The firm's marginal cost is 50 cents. What is the firm spending the 50 cents on? Land, labour, scarce resources. Resources which, if the firm uses up, are not available to be used elsewhere. So it's not only the marginal cost to the firm, it's the marginal cost to society because 50 cents worth of society's scarce resources are being used. Is it a good use of those resources? Yes, because for 50 cents worth of resources, we get €1 worth of value. Is it worth producing 15 units of output? The value of that 15th unit is €1, but the amount of resources needed to be used up is now, say, 75 cents. But still the value is more than the amount of resources. Price is more than opportunity cost. So what society wants is all units made where price is at least as much as the opportunity cost of the resources at the margin. And what's that? 20 units of output. Do we want the 21st unit of output made? We do not, because we value the 21st unit at €1, but the marginal cost of production, the amount of resources used up, is 1/10's worth of resources. We would rather those resources went somewhere else and produced output valued more highly. So we've established an important principle. From the point of view of the firm, the best use of its resources is to produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. But from society's point of view, the best use of resources is that firms produce where marginal cost equals demand. Marginal cost equals average revenue. But in perfect competition, marginal revenue and average revenue are the same thing. So what maximizes the consumer's welfare is the same level of output as that which maximizes producer's welfare. Perfect competition is an ideal, not just from the firm's point of view, but from society's point of view as well. So do we come to the conclusion then that the market system always works wonderfully well? We do not. We come to the conclusion that given the right circumstances, it works beautifully. Given perfect competition, the firm's output, which is best, is the same as society's output that's best. But things are different if we now look at a market structure where firms have monopoly power. And now we're going to look at a monopolistic situation and see that what maximizes the well-being of consumers is not the same as that which maximizes the well-being of producers. And what I want you to look out for is to see how a monopolist will choose to produce less output at a higher price than the output which maximizes society's welfare. So we'll find that what is most efficient for the firm in terms of its price and output decision is not the same as that which is most efficient for consumers. Let's look at our monopoly diagram that we've seen before to see if we can establish why. So here's our monopolistic firm with a downward sloping demand curve where demand and average revenue are always the same. And as we've seen before, marginal revenue is not the same as average revenue. Marginal revenue declines at twice the speed of the average revenue curve. So the firm, given the marginal cost curve here, as we've seen before, produces where marginal cost equals marginal revenue and sells up at the price. So we've got an optimum for the firm of Q2 output at P2 price. The idea now is to see that what is optimal for society is Q1 output at P1 price, where marginal cost is equal to demand. Now, why is that the case? For the same reasons as we saw when we looked at perfect competition. It's always in society's interests that the output be produced if the value they place on it is greater than marginal cost, greater than marginal resource usage. So if we look at this unit here, the first unit after Q2 that the monopolist won't produce because it doesn't pay him to, the value to society of this unit of output, the price that they're prepared to pay, is greater than the amount of resources used up in terms of the marginal cost curve. If that unit were made, society would have a benefit because they value it at even more than the cost of the resources. So society wishes the output to be made until marginal cost, marginal resource usage, is the same as the price, which is what we get at Q1 output and P1 price. So the socially efficient price and output is P1 Q1. The most efficient output for maximizing the firm's profits are at P2 Q2. So now we've introduced a divergence between what is optimal for society and what is optimal for the firm. Why is that divergence there? Because in perfect competition, price and marginal revenue were the same thing. In monopoly, it isn't. The firm always wants to produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. In perfect competition, that means producing where marginal cost is equal to demand, which gives us a social optimum. But in monopoly, it does not mean producing where marginal cost is equal to demand, because demand and marginal revenue are not the same thing. We can even go back to the diagram and get an idea of the extent to which society's welfare has been reduced by the presence of monopoly power. On this unit here, the loss of welfare to society is the difference between the price we would pay and the value of the resources used up in production. And so we can see that if the firm restricts its output to Q2 and society wants it to produce Q1, the loss of welfare on all these units is the difference between price and marginal cost. So this shaded area represents what is called by economists the deadweight loss of monopoly power. Some economists have tried to measure the extent to which society loses as a result of monopoly power. It's a very difficult thing to do. You need to know the nature of the demand curve, the elasticity of demand, and so on. So although in principle we know that monopoly power is going to misallocate resources and is going to reduce consumer welfare, it's hard to measure the extent to which that is the case. But we do have a clear idea now of how monopoly power misallocates scarce resources. That leads us on to say, if this is the case, you would expect most governments in market economies to want to control the power of monopolistic firms in order to prevent them from misallocating scarce resources and exploiting consumers. And when we do look to see if governments have the power to do this, we find that just about all governments in functioning market economies do have this power. And they usually have it in one of two ways. They seek to control the structure of firms to prevent the build-up of monopoly power, and they seek to control the behaviour of monopolistic firms also. Let's think first of all about controlling the structure. One of the commonest ways in which monopoly power gets established, with all that potential for misallocating scarce resources, is via merger activity. Firms that are competing against one another merge, or one firm takes over the other, and gradually the amount of competition in the industry gets reduced, and we move closer and closer towards monopoly power. Now, there may be some benefits to society because there may be economies of scale in the production of goods and services as firms get bigger, but there are costs. And the cost is that you're giving these firms more and more power to exploit consumers. So what you might expect is that governments would have the power to prevent mergers taking place unless they were fairly sure they were in society's interests. And so in most societies, if two large firms wish to merge, or one large firm wishes to take over another large firm, they will have to go to the government and get permission. And the government will have power to prevent firms doing it, deny them that permission. What is the logic of doing that? It is to prevent the build-up of monopoly power, which will enable those firms to exploit consumer welfare. Then there's a second way in which you might expect governments to want to control firms' behaviour, and that is not just by preventing the build-up of monopoly power, but by controlling the behaviour of firms that already have it. And governments do this as well. One of the commonest ways they do it is to take firms with monopoly power and to impose price controls to prevent firms using their power to exploit consumers. So in the UK, for example, there are many examples of firms with considerable monopoly power, water companies. In any one region of the country, there will only be one supplier of water. If the firm were left to make its own decision about price and output, it could charge a very high price, well in excess of marginal cost, because there are no close substitutes for consumers to turn to. So governments impose a price ceiling, and a water company is only allowed to increase its price when it gets permission from the government to do so. So we have a reason for wanting to control monopoly power, and we can do it both by affecting the structure of the firm and by the behaviour of the firm that has its monopoly power. Finally, now we're in a position to answer the question that we began with: how efficient is the market system at meeting consumers' needs? If we're going to do that, we need to be clear what we mean by efficiency. And there are two key aspects to efficiency. One of them we call productive efficiency, and the other we call economic efficiency or allocative efficiency. Productive efficiency is about whether firms produce output at the least possible cost. If a firm is productively efficient, it produces whatever level of output it's chosen at the least possible cost of doing so. If it's doing that, it is productively efficient. But there's a different question. Are firms allocatively efficient? Allocative efficiency is about whether firms are producing outputs in the amounts that consumers want. In principle, you could have a firm producing some output at the lowest possible cost of doing so, and they're producing output that nobody wants to buy. So allocative efficiency is about the extent to which producers are responding to consumer demands and producing output in the optimal amounts, whether marginal cost is equal to demand. So we've got these two measures of efficiency, productive and allocative. Let's ask the question now, to what extent is the market system efficient in each of these two ways? First of all, productive efficiency. Are perfectly competitive firms productively efficient? Do they keep their costs down to a minimum? Absolutely. How do I know that? Because when they keep their costs down to a minimum, in the long run, they still only just cover costs. They still only make a normal profit. If they didn't keep their costs down to a minimum, they would not make a normal profit. They wouldn't survive in the industry. So the pressures of competition oblige them to be productively efficient. Are monopolists productively efficient? The answer is yes, if we assume they're profit maximizers. Part of maximizing profits is to minimize the costs of producing whatever level of output you've chosen. So you're going to be productively efficient as a monopolistic firm if you wish to maximize your profits. The only question we might raise about whether monopolistic firms are truly productively efficient is that because they operate behind high barriers, they would, if they chose, be in a position to live a relatively quiet life, not keep their costs down to a minimum, because it's easier, it's less effort to allow your costs to rise above the minimum. So it's possible that one could argue that monopolistic firms that are not under pressure from competition may choose not to be productively efficient. But if they are profit maximizers, they will be. Now, what about allocative efficiency? Allocative efficiency is about producing outputs in the proportions that consumers want. Do perfectly competitive firms do that? Absolutely. They produce where marginal cost is equal to demand. So they produce just the right amount for maximizing consumers' welfare. Price reflects marginal opportunity cost. Do monopolists maximize welfare, the welfare of consumers? Are they allocatively efficient? No, because they produce to maximize profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and that, as we've seen, is not where marginal cost is equal to demand. So the monopolistic firm is unlikely to be allocatively efficient. So when governments and business people talk about the need for efficiency, they generally mean cost efficiency, productive efficiency, getting costs down to a minimum. But there's an equally important question. Are they allocatively efficient? Are resources being used in an optimal way for society? We now have a strong case for government intervention in the market system. Where monopoly power exists, there is a case for government involvement to control the exploitation of consumers by such firms.